Hello. This week we have a double parsha, Behar and Bechukosai. Behar starts with the law of Shemitah, the land of Israel lying fallow every 7 years in the 7th year of the cycle, like a Shabbos for the land, and that's followed after 7 cycles by the Yovel, the Jubilee, the 50th year, when all indentured servants go free and the ancestral estates return to their original owners. We're promised that if we keep the mitzvahs, we'll be able to dwell in the land of Israel in material comfort with rains and crops and things like that. And we're warned of the very dire and unpleasant consequences if we don't keep the mitzvahs, exile and curses. And the parsha ends, the double parsha ends, with the monetary value of different pledges to God. So 2 quite short divrei Torah, 1 from each parsha. We're told in Parshas Behar that it's forbidden to take interest on a loan to a Jew. And straight after the verses which explain that, there's one of those verses which crops up every now and then in the Torah, which reminds us, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan to be your God. So given that they come fairly regularly, the question is, why does this verse appear now? What's the connection between coming out of Egypt to live in Israel and not charging interest? So the Sifrul, the halachic midrash on the book of Leviticus, suggests that it was actually a condition that Bnei Israel don't charge interest. It was on condition of that Hashem brought them out of Egypt. So you could ask reasonably, why this more than any other mitzvah? The notable Yehuda, Rabbi Yechezkel Landau, writing in 18th century Prague, says in a sefer called Avas Sion that the reason that God brought the Jewish people out of Egypt was to take them to the land of Israel, which would provide them with the extra merits which a person gains from living there, and this would enable them to move into Olam Haba, into the next world. So they left Egypt especially to go to Eretz Israel to get the merits to take them into the next world. Now, the rabbis say that the punishment for lending money with interest is that a person won't be resurrected at the resurrection of the dead, Techiyas Hamesim. When this happens, it's not going to be such a simple thing as you might imagine. I think we're told, obviously nobody knows what it's going to be like, but we're told that if people who are buried outside the land of Israel, it's not going to be such a pleasant experience, and it'll be much easier for those people who are buried in the land of Israel. But if you're not going to be resurrected at all because you lent money with interest, then there was no advantage to living in the land of Israel or to being brought out of Egypt. And that's why the 2 verses are juxtaposed. Looking now at Parshas Bechukosai, at the end of the curses, we're promised that Hashem will remember his covenant with the patriarchs, the Avos, in a verse that's familiar from the Rosh Hashanah davening in Musaf. It says, then I will remember my covenant with Yaakov, I will remember also my covenant with Yitzchak, and also my covenant with Avram, and I will remember the land. So it's a bit odd. Normally when we talk about the Avos, we say Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov in chronological order, and here they're the other way around, Yaakov, Yitzchak, Avram. So Rashi picks up on this and he says, well look, we're talking about the Jewish people being remembered in the merit of the forefathers. So we're going to say that if Yaakov had enough merits, then we'll be redeemed through him. And if he wasn't, as it were, good enough, then we'll use Yitzchak and we'll rely on his merits. And if Yitzchak wasn't adequate, then we'll rely on Avram. So what does it mean Yaakov wasn't good enough? You know, Yaakov Avinu, the father of the 12 tribes, he's in terms of people like us, he's impossible to calculate his merits. So how can he not be good enough? So the Nachlas Yaakov, Rabbi Yaakov Loberbaum, living in Lissa, which is one of those places which could have been Germany or could have been Poland, depending on when he lived there, he says, well, what it means he's not good enough, it depends what punishment the Jewish people deserved for not keeping the mitzvahs. If it was burning, then Avram had been thrown into a furnace by Nimrod, the fiery furnace, and so he's got the right kind of merits. If it was killing, then Yitzchak had offered himself up to the knife, and so he has the right kind of merits. And if it was exile, then Yaakov had gone into exile when he ran away from Esau and went to live with his uncle Lavan for all those years. So the first option, obviously, is to go for the least bad punishment, which is exile. And so we're going to say, well, look, exile, Yaakov has experienced exile. We're going to use those merits and use them to bargain our way out of this. If, in fact, the punishment deserved was worse and it was killing, then we're going to have to increase to Yitzchak's merits. And if it was to be thrown into the fiery furnace, then you have to use Avram. And so that's why it's done in reverse order, because the level of punishment, the merits which the forefathers had, the level of punishment increased, as it were, and so you want to start with the lowest one and hope that will be adequate and only increase up to the maximum if necessary. A bit of a interesting but miserable Dvar Torah. So finish with a more positive thought. The next year is a Shemitah year. There's lots of preparations already in place for it. And so to end with the hope that we will all merit to keep not only Shemitah, but all the other mitzvahs as well, and to merit the brachas, and everybody should have a very good Shabbos.